Good evening, everyone, and welcome you all in CRG's public lecture series. The title of today's public lecture is Fleeing and Staying, a Nuanced View of the Bangladesh Refugee Crisis of 1971. The lecture will be delivered by Professor Meghna Guhathakurta, Executive Director, Research Initiative Bangladesh, Dhaka, Professor Sabyasachi Chaudhury, Vice Chancellor, Rabndra University, Kolkata, will moderate this public lecture session. Before I give mic to Professor Chaudhury, let me tell one or two words about this lecture series and about CRG. As you all know that CRG is a leading institute in not only in South Asia but in world in its research in migration and post-migration and labor studies. And this lecture series is CRG's research plan to work on the refugee crisis during 1971 Liberation War. So may I now request Sabyasachi sir to please preside the session.
Good evening, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. We are celebrating 50 years of the liberation of Bangladesh this year. And today's discussion will be very interesting from that perspective. But before we start today's webinar, let me also share with you, many of you are friends of the Calcutta Research Group and have been associated with this research institute for a long time. So meanwhile, we have lost one of our founder members and one of the former presidents of the Calcutta Research Group, Professor Pradeep Kumar Bose, a renowned sociologist. And that is a major loss to the Calcutta Research Group, who was also involved, editing a volume, who edited a volume entitled Refugees in West Bengal a long time back, about 20 years back. So having said that, having remembered him, let us come back to today's discussion. As I was telling you that we are celebrating, the golden jubilee of the liberation of Bangladesh, but this is also the year of 50 years of genocide in East Pakistan and now Bangladesh. So in a world where the movement of people has been the norm since time immemorial, in today's world, we find that identity documents issued by the states have posed or are posing a serious challenge to the assumptions of citizenship as a political ideal. And after two partitions of the Indian subcontinent or of South Asia in 1947 and again in 1971, these issues have not been resolved. And we know that civil war started in Pakistan, the then undivided Pakistan, after the December 1970 election results were published. And there was genocide, which has now been recognized very recently. And hundreds and thousands of men, women, children, and elderly persons had to flee their homeland. And there was widespread violence, including killing, rapes, physical torture, plunder, looting, extortion, and damage of property. And particularly the situation of different kinds of minorities that became a major issue. So in this situation, we are going to have today's lecture. And today's distinguished speaker is none other than Professor Meghna Guhathakurta, who is the Executive Director of the Research Initiatives Bangladesh. Previously, she was Professor of International Relations at Dhaka University, Bangladesh. And after obtaining her PhD from the University of York in the United Kingdom, Meghna has also been a member of the Netherlands Development Research Council from 1996 to 2002, where she chaired the subcommittee on post-conflict development. She was also a member of the South Asian People's Committee on the Rights of Minorities. Her areas of interest include development, gender, and politics in South Asia. She has published extensively on gender, development and minority rights, and conflict and peace building. She is also the associate editor of the Journal of Social Studies, published from the Center for Social Studies, Dhaka, and she is also associated with the Action Research Journal published by Sage Publications. Her recent publications include a book co-authored with William Van Schendel entitled The Bangladesh Reader, The Politics of British Aid Policy Formation, The Case of British Aid to Bangladesh, 1972 to 1986. She has also co-edited a volume called SARC Beyond State-Centric Cooperation, published in 1992. And she has extensively published in her own mother tongue, that is the Bengali language. And we find that in this situation of, when we are celebrating this, we are celebrating this 50 years of liberation of Bangladesh, and we are also, having, remembering this 50 years after genocide and 50 years after a new refugee situation emerged. And when it emerged, in fact, it is a kind of, when Professor Guhathakurta will be speaking today, it will be, studying refugees at a time when refugee studies in South Asia probably did not emerge. United Nations was already there, as well as the UNHCR was also there. But unfortunately, UN and UNHCR, all these international agencies, they had very little to play. So it is now over to Professor Meghna Guhathakurta.
Thank you very much, Sabyasachi, for your very generous introduction. I am delighted to talk a little bit and answer your questions about the topic, which is what I call Fleeing and Staying, a nuanced view of the Bangladesh Refugee Crisis of 1971. The reason I chose this title was to actually go behind the predominance of the visual that comes across in mainstream reporting of a refugee crisis. It usually consists, though are not limited to, the people en masse crossing borders, huddled together in the squalor of camps, railway stations, and marketplaces, dismal scenes of their day-to-day miseries, and perilously close to disease and death. But also projected are scenes of mass atrocities as root causes which made them flee in the first instance. Retaliation or resistance of the victimized people also captures headlines. But stories that are not told, or those that blurred the lines between fleeing or staying behind, between attaining refugee status and remaining displaced within one's own homeland, resilience and resistance, the day-to-day stories of survival, both inside the camps as well as outside, and the varied dynamics of return or multiple returns are the ones that drew my attention. Now, the enormity of the refugee influx into West Bengal in 1971 is portrayed by the following statistics. As per the Refugee Relief and Rehabilitation Department of the Government of West Bengal, the census figures show the numbers of refugees from East Pakistan in 1971 was nearly 6 million or 60 lakhs, but in most reports, it is estimated that around 10 million East Bengali refugees entered India during the early months of the war, of whom 1.5 million may have stayed back after Bangladesh became independent. Julian Francis, then based in West Bengal, in charge of operations for Oxfam, and conferred citizenship of Bangladesh for his contribution to the liberation war of Bangladesh in 1971, wrote, 10 million Bangladeshis fled to India as refugees And as estimated, 20 million were internally displaced in Bangladesh, about 40% of the population. He reminiscences, some days we saw 50,000 Bangladeshis a day cross the many border crossings to India. 20,000 or 30,000 a day was normal. The largest refugee camp in 1971 was Salt Lake, Calcutta, which had about 250,000 people. Now, interestingly, the CRG's office is based in Salt Lake, we know that. And so it's very interesting that CRG, as one of the pioneering centers for research on refugees and migration, should be based in a place of such a large extent. Of course, now currently, the Salt Lake looks like what we in Dhaka call the Gulshan area, which is a very elitist area. So it'll be worthwhile remembering that in your winter courses, that way you are actually located and situated, and the historical implications of that place in terms of refugee studies. A district-wise breakup in 1971 shows the main thrust of the refugee influx was 24 Parganas, 22.3% of the total refugees, Nodia, 20.3%, Bankura, 19.1%, and Kolkata, 12.9%. But having said all these figures, I must tell you that for today's talk, I will not be giving facts and figures. Rather, I have not studied the Bangladesh refugee crisis as a scholar or academic, but I will use several personal narratives through which to elaborate the intricate complexity of the crisis from different perspectives. The narratives are my own as a member of a war-affected family belonging to a minority community, a family originating in West Bengal, whose migratory trend I traced in my studies on family histories of the partition, of which all of you might be very well acquainted with. And the other narratives of observers and actors in the crisis, like Julian Francis of Oxfam, Freida Brown of the Australian Communist Party, and K.K. Sinha, a radical humanist who died in a motor accident while returning from relief work in the camps. All these are rather unknown stories, and hence I find it a pleasure, but have touched my life as well, and lives around me. So I would like to really look at the testimonies as well. Now, the first, I would like to talk about the fleeing and staying narratives of displacement and refugeehood. And also within it are embedded legacies of the past and present complexities. My own story is, I Meghna Guhathakurta in 1971, was living with my father, who was then provost of Jagannath Hall at Dhaka University and teacher of English literature. And my mother was a headmistress of a high school, a girls' high school in the old town. And I was about 15 years of age in 71 and in class 10. So on the first, just a brief background, I'm not going to dwell on it a lot, is that fact that my father was one of the ones that were sacrificed in the altar of independence, you could say, on the very first night, where during the Operation Searchlight, where the Pakistan Army had operations targeting the Dhaka University and also old settlements, Hindu settlements in the old town, and the Rajapakh police station in Dhaka. And we all know what happened that night, so I'm not going to go into details, but among it in my personal memory is the fact that my father was taken out and asked his name and shot and his religion, and then shot and killed by bullets. He was injured by the bullets, and we couldn't take him to a hospital right then and there because of the curfew. But on the 27th morning only could we take him to the hospital, which was then full of injured people from bullet wounds. dead bodies, and basically the whole city of Dhaka was in turmoil, and basically giving the remnants of a killing field. If you look at the streets, you saw that. But these have been written elsewhere. After what happened after my father died because of his wounds was so critical an injury that he died on the 30th of March, 1971. We couldn't take his body because the ambulance which was going to take his body was then surrounded by all the army officials and not allowed to come into the premises of the medical college. And then we had to therefore leave him there in the bed and then flee for our lives. My mother and I, from then on, took shelter in different places, friends and not relatives. We had no relatives. All our relatives, near relatives, were all in India, in Calcutta. And my mother and I went to friends' places who took us, gave us shelter. One of the very first places was Dr. Tajul Hussain, who had come, in fact, with the ambulance to pick up the dead body of my father, but was not able to do it. Dr. Tajul Hussain was a humanist, like my father, a follower of Roy's ideal, M.N. Roy's ideals. And he was very close to the Awami League at that time. So he knew what was happening. And the first night I remember, he asked my mother whether she wanted to go to India, because he had the means of taking us to India, and possibly because all our relatives were there and we would be more protected there. But my mother somehow refused. She did not go, knowing that my father was killed and she had to protect me, a 15-year-old daughter, in many strange houses and in many capacities, in many other disguises, you could say, that we had to live a displaced life. But I always wondered, but her explanation to me was given when she went to tried to get the death certificate of my father from the hospital, because it was necessary. Although she was a headmistress and she was getting some salary, but you know that it was difficult to maintain all the sustain ourselves. We needed money, so in order to get the Provident Fund from the university and other things, she needed a death certificate. But when she went to get that death certificate, the doctor told her, we can only give you this certificate, which was the fact that my father died of pneumonia, or rather lungs, kind of respiratory attack. And but my mother came to me, she had to take her, from the advice of her friends, she had to take that in order to recover her Provident Fund. But she said that, look, Lola, if I take this, then we won't ever be able to prove the death of your father as he was killed, and as a murder and as an assassination. So I fear that if we go to India, and although the opportunity is there for us, what do you think if we stay? So I was at that point, I was listening to my mother all the time. I said yes to everything she said, because I was not in a position to understand what I should do for myself. And so my mother stayed on. And that staying on took us to various places. Every month we would be staying on in a new place. Not that we wanted to, but the first place we stayed, something happened there that would force us to leave that place. For example, the first place we stayed, the husband of the elder daughter who was taking shelter, every house was a refugee camp at that time, a displaced camp, you could say, that all the relatives from all places came and huddled together in one place where they thought they would be protected or they would be safe. And when the husband of that, when the call came from the Pakistan government that everyone should join work, and or else they would be punished. So the husband, who was an engineer, took a bus, and as they were going to the northern districts where he was posted, they passed through the Mirpur area, which was peopled by Urdu-speaking community or Bihari camps, as we call them. And their bus was attacked, and their body was never found. The person who was his father-in-law was a doctor, went through every manhole and searched the bodies. No. So we had to go away to another place, another unknown student of my father. And there too, they had sort of non-Bengalis living around that area, which after a month, they got suspicious about who we were. So they told my mother that, and my mother was a well-known person because she was a headmistress of the school. And she was more than that, she was the wife of a person who was executed by the Pakistan Army. So in that sense, it was not safe to keep my mother. They said that we're ready to keep Dola, which is my nickname, but not she. Then my mother had to look around. Then we went on to, according to I was studying at a convent, Holy Cross Convent School, and the sisters were there to help us and give us support. My headmistress of my school then told my mother that we will enter you into a hospital, the Holy Family Hospital, which was run by the sisters at that time, and under the name of Barbara Gomez, so that no one will not have a Hindu name. And I was going to enter into an orphanage, which is under the name of Monica Gomez. So that's how we spent the next month. And then it went on until finally, one after the other, I think we stayed at 6 different places in all these 9 months. My mother, sometimes separately from my mother, sometimes together. That is a big story by itself. But the fact that the staying is what I wanted to emphasize was staying, even though displaced. And we were not only displaced in terms of the places that we were there, but displaced, in fact, because of our identity. My mother took whatever she could from our belongings. We couldn't take much, but you know what she took? She took albums of my family albums. She took them, and they were written in my family albums, the name of my mother and my father in some of the photographs. And we were told to erase those names and so I had to write my daddy or my mummy, something like that. So there was a total erasure of identity. The fact that we had to take Christian names means that a total displacement of identity also accompanied us. But interestingly enough, I will now talk about how another friend of my father, who was Mr. K.K. Sinha, Kollan Kumar Sinha, he was the director of the Institute of Political and Social Studies in Calcutta. He was also a royalist and had known my father for a long time. And incidentally, K.K. Sinha was working in the village. He had been hearing news about my father and another royalist friend called Habibur Rahman, a mathematics professor of Rajshahi University, who was also killed. And even in 1971, he was writing tributes to them from Calcutta, and also working with his wife, going to the camps in Kharagpur and attending the refugees there. And very unfortunately, one day on the return from a refugee camp in Kharagpur, he was driving, and he was met with a motor accident, a car accident. And his wife was taken injured, and he somehow drove his wife to a hospital where the wife got better, but then he had a heart attack and he died. But before that, he had written this book called The Bangladesh Revolution, the struggle for Bangladesh Revolution of Bangladesh. And I would like to quote him, the fact that when I heard my mother say the actual reason for not going to India and staying behind was a reason that she felt the legacy to stay on of my father. And those legacies were not only embedded in 71, they had past legacies in 1947. And this is what I'd like to quote from the tribute that he wrote. And the fact that the part of staying, or the role of staying, or the action of staying was not new to my family. And it was because of the ideological character, because of an altruistic ideal, which drew from my father's belief in M.N. Roy, and how he had advised him during 1947 not to come to India, but because he was a leader, an intellectual leader, he should not contribute to the panic of the partition, but rather give leadership to those who stayed behind. And K.K. Sinha wrote how he met him in London when he was doing his PhD after from 1963 to 67. And within this, the Indo-Pakistan War took place. So how many times did I coax him to come to India instead of returning to Dhaka after his study was over? But he never faltered to say no. I wondered why was he so adamant and what gave him such confidence. We went into the virility and growth of the intellectual scene in Dhaka, sometimes mentioning names of young scholars as well as old. And he always ended by saying that the intellectual horizon of young Bengali Muslims in East Pakistan was undergoing a revolution. A new generation was rising, and it was that which sustained his confidence. The new intellectual elite that was arising was much more virile, much more creative and self-reliant, and much more open-minded and flexible. And he felt that he was sharing the joy of this emergence of this new rising sun. How right he was. I now go on to talk about another family, which many of you who have read my partition, family histories of the partition will know, a Muslim family who originated from Barashat. And I happen to be in touch also now with him. Minhaj, I called him in my past partition stories, but now he has agreed to be called by his real name, which is Mubarak Hussein. He is the husband of my friend, Suraya Begum. And so his story is that of fleeing and displacement and fleeing. So here he had come to from West Bengal to Bangladesh, at that time East Pakistan, hardly 4 or 5 years ago from 71. So he's a young person who barely got into college in the first year in Rajshahi University. He was first of all in Jasor, living with his elder brother and his family. And he then went to study economics in Rajshahi. And then the March 1971 came. After the 7th March speech of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, everything closed down. So he took kind of a cargo wagon back to Jasor, because then hardly anyone could get any transport. And after that, but the family faced a lot of hostility from the neighbors, who are mostly non-Bengalis. And as after the 25th of March, their aggression grew, so much so that they decided not to stay in their house, but go to somewhere nearby, friends, relatives, etc., who were around in Jasor, rural areas or the outskirts of Jasor. And then he, after being displaced, and they decided to go and stay in another house, but suddenly they realized that that house, someone told them that the person of that house had written his name in the book of Razakars, or collaborators with the Pakistan army. So it was not safe for them to stay there. Then they decided that, okay, fine, then maybe we should go towards the border. So they were joined, 25 persons in a group, relatives, extended relatives, distant relatives, all together. And they walked and walked the whole of 24 hours towards the border area, where they crossed the border, basically, and then after crossing near Bonga, and then after crossing it, because they had already their father living in Barashat, they went straight to their father's house. But the father was very happy to see them. He also received all the refugees that came with them, and they settled all around their household, their homestead, in their lands. So he said that basically it was the fact that they were received, and he described to me how the refugee situation was like as he saw it. He said all the marketplaces, the railway stations, the bus stations were full of refugees from East Pakistan, and they had taken shelter. But at first, mostly the Hindu refugees came because they were the first to be to feel the fear and the assault and being targeted by the Pakistan army. The Muslims also came, but they came in masses later on, slightly later on, because first they spent in a displaced situation like their family, thinking that maybe things would get better and they would be able to gravitate back towards their home. But when that did not seem a likelihood, then they also came to their also joined the Hindu refugees, and they also joined the masses. En masse they came in. So at first the refugees were scattered all across the districts, the border districts, and Barashat, also the outskirts of Calcutta. But when the real en masse refugees came, and especially Muslim refugees, felt more protected in gravitating towards Calcutta because of it was a city. And so they went in. But all through, he noticed the welcoming signs of the host community, which was people from West Bengal. It was called Joy Bangla. They did not say people from East Pakistan or people from Bangladesh. They said people from Joy Bangla. And you know how that became a code of the whole struggle of Joy Bangla, because they said that even, you know, that in around October 71, there was this eye disease which came in, and then that was called the Joy Bangla disease. And so everything became Joy Bangla. So when they used to board the trains, it was free, oh, Joy Bangla. And even buses, when refugees could not afford the ticket that they had, pay for the ticket, they said that, yes, Joy Dada jodi ইচ্ছা হয় দেবেন, যদি থাকে দেবেন, জয় পারেন দেবেন, আর না হলে থাক। So whatever you can give, you give, or if you can't, it's okay. It was that cordial a relationship at first, but of course later on there were issues that were raised, like any other refugee situation. It was raised issues of hostility, but there were few and far between during the time of that. As Mubarak Hussein said. So when did the family return? Of course, the family, interestingly, the hostility that he met with was his own family, not allowing them to stay. They allowed them to stay, but ideologically, the Muslims of Barashat, and his father included, were very much Congress oriented, and also Pakistan in terms of they believed that Pakistan was a place for a destination for the Muslims in partition times, and that's why he egged his own family members to move forward. But he also believed that the people in Pakistan, East Pakistan, the Bengalis of East Pakistan, did not give proper allegiance to this, to the Pakistan state, and they were partly responsible for the fall of the Pakistan state or destabilizing it. So they also believed that. However, Mubarak Hussein, who went as a young person to East Pakistan along with his family, said that on the very first instance, he knew by looking at going to Rajshahi that this Pakistan dream was a total failure. And there was no dream of Ayub Khan's Pakistan. There was no Ayub Khan's Pakistan, which would prove to be a paradise for all Muslims. He saw, as a young person, he had friends who were getting into the war mode and into the Mukti Bahini, and he also he also was a young person who at that time had very few years of East Pakistan. He still felt estranged from West Bengal. He still felt estranged as an Indian. So that's why he had this kind of dilemma, even within himself, about what does he fight for? What does he stand for? And he was still searching. He was still searching as the end of the war came. Jasor fell around the 6th or 7th of December 1971. And Tajuddin Ahmed, who was then based in Kolkata, was supposed to go in a sort of a convoy to give a speech in Jasor, the first speech of the then Prime Minister of the provisional government. And there was a whole convoy which ran past Jasor Road and past Barashok, and he got onto it. He got onto it and he went into Jasor with that convoy, heard the speech, then tried to get in touch. By the way, I forgot that his elder brother and his wife had, by that time, had already gone back to Bangladesh. And we know that many people, when Yahya gave a declaration of forgiveness for those who had gone by and welcomed them back with land, property, etc., Yahya Khan, they listened. They said that they wondered perhaps that after all, their life and their occupation, their livelihood was all in East Pakistan, and if that, they should go back to their jobs because here they were just refugees. So they had already gone back. But when Mubarak Hussein tried to find them, he could not find them. He went even to Khulna, but came back because of the dangers of the situation. The Indian army was already there in Khulna and warned him of landmines and other things. So he left a message in charcoal in the dilapidated house that they lived in Jasor, saying, I had come, I could not find you. Please write back to my father because he's worried about you. Then he went back to Barashok. He finally left Barashok back to East Pakistan around either end of January or even end of December or January, and went back to his student days. But so we see that there has been multiple returns and multiple returns and journeys back and forth. Those in the border area could do that, but not those in Dhaka. Those in Dhaka or in the central part of Bangladesh could not go back so easily. And therefore, it was important now to relate something from Julian Francis' writing because he was based in the camps and how dismal it was in the camps, which is the picture we get. But we do not get it in his as a personal experience. And this is how I will quote from his writings. So international NGOs like Oxfam were finding it hard to accept the reports that were coming to their offices from Calcutta. In the field, we were witnessing death and disease on a scale that was unimaginable. I still have nightmares about the deaths of children in refugee camps in India. I still remember as though it was yesterday, the wounds yesterday, the wounds of men who had managed to arrive to safety after being attacked by machetes by the collaborators of the Pakistani authorities. Some of the wounds had become septic during the painful journeys. Sometimes in my nightmares, I see the body of a dead child lying in the rain, its arms and legs gnawed off by dogs, its eyes pecked out by crows. I will never forget the babies with their skin hanging loosely in folds from their tiny bones, lacking the strength even to lift their heads. The children with legs and feet swollen with edema and malnutrition, limp in the arms of their mothers, babies going blind for a lack of vitamin or covered with sores that will not heal. Seeing in the eyes of their parents the despair, wondering if they will ever have their children well again. Seeing the corpse of the child who died the night before. It was only when cholera swept through the camps towards Calcutta that the conscience of the world was alerted. But even this killer came and went. It left behind what was there before, suffering and despair, no homes, little or no food, insufficient medical supplies, and worst of all, no hope. Can I ask how much time I have left? Because on that will depend on how I cross
you may carry on, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It was in search of this hope that I look back on the refugee crisis, not only as a humanitarian crisis, but it's very important to remember that 1971 refugees in India was not only about humanitarian crisis. It was a crisis. It was a story of resilience and resistance. Narratives which are there but hold separately from this refugee studies. And this should not be. Why? I will now try to elaborate. Here I bring on the testimony of my father's friend, another of my father's friend who had tried to get the ambulance to the hospital, Dr. Chaudhury Hussein. He was in fact made the first health secretary of Bangladesh government, and he was part of the provisional government. He had a very interesting story which he told to me. When the provisional government members had to meet Indira Gandhi in Delhi because they needed permission to have a provisional government in exile in the soil of India. So he mentioned that, I think he mentioned that Barrister Amirul Islam was also there, as well as several leaders of the government. And so Mrs. Gandhi asked them that, why should I allow you to do that? You are, after all, in West Bengal, and West Bengal has borders with East Pakistan. So how am I to know you will not be leading a struggle for united Bengal? And there, at that time, the then Prime Minister of the Provisional Government, Tajuddin Ahmed, gave the answer. He said, "Madam, you see the flag which we bear, and you will see this is the flag. It's in my background as part of the cover page of My 71, which has been brought out by the Department of International Relations. So this is the flag that was being as a symbolic symbol of the Bangladesh at that time. See the flag, Madam, there is a map there. It denotes the territory which we are fighting for. So we cannot be at one with West Bengal or with any other states that are bordering India, because this is the only territory that we are fighting for. And this is Bangladesh. We are calling this territory Bangladesh. So it can be very much, we can see how clever it was, an argument which Indira Gandhi had no answer to. So she allowed and permitted the provisional government to have its seat in West Bengal. I come across another very interesting letter that was given to me by an oral historian. She's Australian, Heather Goodall, And I think she gave a letter of Freida Brown, of the Australian Communist Party leader, later the Socialist Party, and the only woman awardee of the Lenin Peace Prize, who had visited the camp. In that letter, she had written back to her colleagues back in Australia, I visited the training camps and talked with the National Awami Party. The National Awami Party was in opposition. Of course, we know there were various NAP, Hashani, but NAP Muzaffar was the Communist Party leader of the at that time, leading the left front. And she talked of the resilience of the Indian people as well, even after they suffered losses from the cyclone in Orissa, which I don't think any other country could have faced, especially with 10 million refugees. In her report, she also mentioned about the resilience of the refugees, where she met young doctors from East Pakistan, refugees who were giving medical services from camp to camp. So there was all this element of self-help, even in the camps. And this was basically the bearer of hopes. Another bearer of hope was, we learned from the written testimony of Sharmin Murshid, whose whole family had then crossed over to India. And she was a member of the singing troupe that was formed in the camps, which had been made famous with Muktir Gan, directed by Tariq and Catherine Masood, but which was based on the cinematography of Levin Lear of that time and during that time. And also, I think there was all, you have to take into account Topun Bosch's, the film that was aided by Topun Bosch, The 9 Months to Freedom, where also they had pictures of these singing troops, which sang from camp to camp, and also in the Mukto Elaka, which was the freed areas of at that time in East Bengal, and where they sang to raise the what shall I say, raise the consciousness of the people as well as to raise their hopes. And so she relates how they crossed the border. Her father was in fact my father's colleague and senior colleague and very well-respected colleague who had come to see him in the hospital. And he had not wanted to leave, but her mother was a parliamentary leader of East Pakistan. She was elected in 1954. She was elected in 1970. So she was basically a parliamentary leader even when she was a refugee. So they and her two sisters and two elder brothers came to cross the border, and through many deliberations, because again, the father did not want to leave, but the mother said I think that was for the protection of the people. And the whole family became involved in the war. Her brother was served the sector command of 9, commander of sector 9, as well as sector 2, later sector 2 as a Mukti Bahini. And then her elder sister Tazeen was worked in the hospitals in Kollani, and as well as contributed to an archive of 71, as well as worked in the news section of the Bangladesh Betar. Bangladesh Betar was, of course, named as almost another sector through their struggles, because although they were broadcasting from Calcutta, but their broadcast was projected everywhere in Bangladesh, and everywhere in Bangladesh, they raised the hopes of the people. So when Nurjahan Murshid, her mother, later parliamentary member to Bangladesh as well, became part of the diplomatic campaign, a roving ambassador representing the provisional government to win support for it. The foreign ministry formed a special parliamentary team where her mother became a member, along with Foni Bhushan Majumdar and Shamu Azam Hussain. The foreign ministry, it culminated in their sensational address this team made at the joint session of both Bidhan and Lok Sabha in the Central Hall of the Indian Parliament, where they were given a standing ovation. The result was that Yahya Khan tried Nur Jahan Murshid in absentia and served her a 14-year sentence, declaring all her property confiscated and bringing out a warrant against her. Sharmin Murshid writes, "That day we knew we could not return home without freedom." So here we say that, that refugees, and this is a crucial part of the refugee situation. So would you call Murshid, Nur Jahan Murshid a refugee or a freedom fighter? So freedom fighters rose from the refugee situation. And it is very interesting that we learn from another work by Amina Mohsin, who on her experience, not her experience, but experience of other people who were in Pakistan Army in West Pakistan at that time, who were interned by Pakistan, and how they also, in both ideology as well as practically also, they fought for the struggle of Bangladesh. And she was, it was after presenting her paper in a conference, someone said, scholars said that it should be called to be another sector of the Bangladesh liberation struggle. Not only there are 11 sectors, but there is also this sector. And I believe that the refugee situation, which was also Calcutta, which was the seat of the high command for the liberation struggle, and where there was so many training camps in the refugee situation, or in the camps alongside the refugees, that it should also be called another sector of the struggle. So we see that how did these nuances that I mentioned interject into the political discourse to transform harmful stereotypes. The harmful stereotypes are there, even in the policies of Bangladesh. When the refugees came back, or when the people came back from Pakistan, when the refugees came back from India, there was a division made that those who stayed inside the borders of East Pakistan were collaborators, and those who went to India, they were Mukti Bahinis. So all these different, very wrong notions have filtered into the policies of our country. And similarly, also global politics. The global scene has completely changed. How will you look at 71 refugees from the present perspective of refugees that the world now faces, and the policies of the refugee policies that the world now upholds? But before going into that, let me again quote from Julian Francis, something that we should all remember. It is in writing about on World Refugee Day, I think in 2020, Julian Francis wrote, "It is very right to celebrate Bangladesh's remarkable development successes and progress over the years. But we must never forget the pain and suffering that was invested into the foundation of this beautiful country. I will never forget. My recurring nightmares will not allow me to do so." I'm sorry, I get emotional. Julian, if you are there, you're supposed to be here with us. Julian is currently recovering from COVID, so please pray for him. He is leading a very hard struggle of recovering from COVID-19. My recurring nightmares will not allow me to do so. Remembering the birth of Bangladesh should help us to redouble our efforts to see that the world shows more kindness to all the refugees being displaced, and to see that the politicians work more seriously and concertedly to overcome all these problems which create the movement of people as refugees. When Bangladesh has reached 50, we are now facing the Rohingyas as a refugee problem of this almost the same dimension as India faced. But although the world has changed and globally we seem to be forgetting the 71 refugee crisis, it has been there in the bridging of the discourse between UN and the Bangladesh government. For a long time, like the Indian government, the Bangladesh government has not signed the convention of refugee convention, and treats refugees still on a piece-to-piece basis. I mean, different according to its national concerns about national sovereignty and everything, as well as, of course, now citizenship. But we will see that in Rohingyas, when we were involved with the Rohingyas long before the present influx, we saw how we brought up time and again the instance of how Bengalis fled their country and the reception they received in India, how they were sheltered for 9 months with food and clothes and shelter, and how it enabled us to, it was a part of our struggle for our nationhood. This was put forward time and again through exhibitions, through expositions, through writings. And finally, I think the state did realize, but still under certain circumstances and under political sort of considerations, they opened the border to Rohingyas. It was interesting, a comment that was made by a young person who had never seen 71, was basically born in 91, but who was serving the IOM, a Bengali, my own colleague, as well as his colleague, a young girl, who had seen pictures of the Salt Lake camps. That has been in our memorialization of refugeehood, in the memorialization of our struggle, those people living in drain pipes, So time and again, this image had registered in the minds of that young girl. And when she saw the masses of Rohingya coming across the borders, she thought of that picture. She said, I have seen this before. So again, we have legacies of the past, which are of strength and which we can draw upon in order to face what can happen in our own future. I think I will end here. Sorry if I got a bit too emotional, but after all, it is an emotional thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Meghna Guhathakurta, for your very insightful and passionate lecture. I think all the members of the audience this evening or this afternoon, this morning, wherever they are, they must have appreciated your lecture. And it was probably very aptly titled, Fleeing and Staying, a nuanced view of the Bangladesh refugee crisis of 1971. Because it was not really a question of genocide. It was not merely a question of liberation of Bangladesh, a new nation, the youngest nation in South Asia. It was not only a question of, displacement of, say, 10 million people, or, out of that 10 million, as she correctly pointed out, that about 1.5 million probably stayed back. And more than that, there were also, 40% of the total population of the then East Pakistan, they stayed back, but they were, internally displaced persons, what we call them nowadays, IDPs or internally displaced person. So Professor Guhathakurta's lecture was about multiple narratives and multiple journeys, where we had, as she rightly pointed out, that it was a story of acceptance, it was a story of resistance. And it was also, not only a displacement of bodies and displacement of mind, but also displacement of identity. Whether I'm a collaborator or whether I'm a liberator, whether I'm a Rajakar or whether I'm on the side of the Bengali nationalist movement. So all these issues have very, beautifully highlighted by Professor Guhathakurta. And I think now we should take up a few questions that have already come to our chat box. So, and the question and answer box. So first of all, there is a question that what is a sustainable legacy for the refugee crisis of 1971 to the young generation in Bangladesh? Meghna, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you repeat that, Shubhashish?
Yes, sure. The question is, what is the sustainable legacy of the refugee crisis of 1971 for the younger generation in Bangladesh?
Okay. Yes, that's a good question. I tried to touch on it a little bit towards the end when I told you about the younger generation meeting the Rohingya refugees on the borders of Myanmar. I think basically it has a lot because again, this memorialization is important because refugees have not stopped all over the world. In fact, they have continued and in different forms. And although the global scene is different, but I think what the younger generation can learn is how their forefathers were also refugees. This is not something that is easily accepted. Usually you think of refugees as others, and that is others. The Rohingyas are others, Afghans are others, and Syrians are somewhere else. I mean, but the fact that anyone can become a refugee, anyone can become displaced, and that they need protection, and from that is and prevention of such protection and prevention of such occurrences should be in the discourse of our younger generation, because often I've been met with such questions when going abroad, when I used to go abroad at that time, and meeting questions from young Bangladeshis in UK or USA. And I would draw to them that there are so many, they are fighting this otherness in their own situation. So why can't they accept the fact that we also, as a member, as a dominant member of our community, of our state, is also fighting that otherness, or also creating otherness whenever there is someone from another country that comes in to take refuge in Bangladesh. So I think all this is very important to maintain and sustain these discourses. So to answer to your question, that yes, if only we had more, and I think Dr. Amina Mohsen is here, she can perhaps enlighten us that in the International Relations Department, we do talk about this, but I doubt whether in other curriculum of our universities, how much they talk about this, this aspect of refugeehood and how to treat it both in terms of international humanitarian law, as well as discuss it among within our own state laws. And I think what the Rohingya refugee situation has done is to create that awareness, the need for such an awareness. I'm not saying the awareness has come all together, but at least among the young students that goes to our universities and our colleges, they should be looking at it more from that perspective of how to make this refugee crisis more relevant to their own lives and living styles.
Thank you very much. Another question is that, do you think that the partition of Bengal in 1905 was a blunder for the Bengalis that crushed their potential, and therefore 1971 was inevitable?
Please again repeat it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, sure. Do you think that the partition of Bengal in 1905 was a blunder for the Bengalis that crushed their potential, and 1971 was inevitable.
Okay, 1905. Yes, like when you're talking, like in 71, I had to talk about 47. So if you're talking about 47, you have to talk about 1905. Partition is a process, and it is a process of political process within the states of that particular state in which it is happening, as well as of the people. And so we just can't say simple things. We can't just equate simple things of 1905 equal to 1947 equal to 71. I think what made 71 inevitable was the whole process of politicization and the political currents and trends of British India, of India and Pakistan, and ultimately Bangladesh. So it is not a matter of inevitability as much as what did we have to analyze those currents and see how much the state actually took upon itself to handle it or to turn it around. Pakistan being the dream, what did the Pakistan state do to turn around and create this dream to come true? But can it again ask the question that how possible was it, could it come true given the distance of West and East? So basically, it is a lot of questions that we have to ask and not just a simple equation. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. And another question is that yes, do you think that the refugee crisis of 1971, it is the result of the prolonged migration from 1947?
No, it's actually got a lot of different elements. 71 was a result of a mass atrocities, which was never seen. Of course, mass atrocities were there in 47, but it was more in 71, it was definitely a state instigated mass atrocity and very intensive, conceived in a militaristic way under the program or program, you could say, of Operation Searchlight. And so that made it a very different migration from the one that we see in 47.
Yes, we are now running short of time, but there is one more question that, yes, the question is that how should the programs for refugees should look like to be helpful for the migrants and the communities where the people come to in practice. This is, concerning the Rohingya in particular. And therefore, the question is that what would you recommend, especially in terms of gender question?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot to that I can recommend, but since that is not the basic thrust of the talk, but I will speak a little generally of the situation in terms of gender. Gender-based violence is a quite well-known fact in emergency situations, and it has been established so. But it is in doing that, although it is recognized by the UN at a very theoretical level, I think, in actually implementing that policies, we don't see it so much being taken as a central policy among the implementing partners, those who implement that policies as humanitarian actors. And I think, for example, I can give you one example that in the last pandemic, where both refugees as well as the host community there was a rise noticed in the violence against women in the camps as well as in the host communities. So I see that, but in allowing certain emergency service or critical service, they chalked up food, shelter, and health, and water and sanitation. These were the areas that were formulated as critical services, but they did not consider protection from violence against women as a critical service. So many of the humanitarian actors who were giving support to these women were left outside and not allowed to enter the camp. So I would say that makes gender-based violence a critical service, even during emergencies and martial law or whatever they may be, as a critical service in any refugee camps. That would be my suggestion. I would like to, I see a question here which I would like to answer, if it's okay with you.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Yeah. So it says, what percentage of 10 million refugees in India return? That's from Suchitra Shamanto. And she, I think I gave a figure that at least 1.5 million were estimated in staying back, the rest returned. So you can calculate the percentage there. So but more important is your question, what did they return to? Was there support in the new country for those who had lost much? Very interesting question. And here I will say that I did not get to talk about it, but even after the return was very well planned. In fact, it is one of the unsung success stories of the UN. The UN formulated, under the panacea called UNROB, UNROB, which is United Nations Relief Operation of Bangladesh, where they coordinated under the leadership of UNHCR all the humanitarian actors which would receive the returnees and provide for shelter and the land that they lost or anything. In terms of lost, they also gained. And this is something which was even asked to us as war-affected families, that what did you gain? We gained independence, we gained freedom, we gained the capacity to live in our own countries, in our own homes, in the safety of a state that we wanted. And ultimately, that state also we have to reckon with. But from the refugee situation to the situation in Bangladesh, in the freedom, we could be who we are. As I said, my own angst was about the loss of identity. I could not say I was Meghna Guhathakurta in that country. If East Pakistan remained, would I be able to say that still? I wonder. I don't think so. And now in Bangladesh, I can say Meghna Guhathakurta. I can say, unfortunately, I can say what happened to my father. So this is the question of identity that we all came back to. And why did so many people come back? Many people wondered that why did so many people come back and not stay behind, even those who could stay behind, meaning minority communities, Hindu. I have seen families who were who were put in, the execution line of execution, under brush fire, who was put in a line and was brush fired, and he survived from there. He went to India and then came back again. And one wondered why, after facing such traumatic instances, did he come back? Because, as Julian Francis said, there was hope. There was hope that we will not relive this situation ever again, and that we will get our identities back, identities that we struggled for as Bengalis.
Thank you. You were referring to Julian Francis, and he is with us and
Yes.
listening to you and watching you. And he's also feeling emotional, and we all wish Julian a very speedy recovery. And we also have with us Professor Amina Mohsin and Professor Anabi Shomadar. So would any one of them would like to raise any other point before we conclude this session? Yes, Professor Shomadar.
No, Amina can go ahead if Amina has any comment.
I think Amina has left, I'm sorry. So you can go ahead.
I have appreciated Meghna's lecture, and the title was actually evocative very much. So I hope that CRG will upload it with properly, titling and all that, and it should be made available for public access. Meghna has written, and these are very instructive writings on the oral histories of partition, the coming and going across the borders. And once again, she demonstrates how family histories, personal narratives, and other accounts of such type can be brought to bear upon in an understanding of the Bangladesh refugee crisis. I hope that Rituparna is present here. She is working on the 1971 refugee crisis, and Jacob Littman is also here. I saw his name. So this has been a very good talk, and we have learned so much. And I appreciate the method that Meghna has used in approaching the 1971 refugee crisis. Thank you, Meghna.
Thank you, Professor Shomadar.
Thank you, Ranavidya. Thank you very much.
Yes, Jakob also appreciates your lecture this evening or afternoon or morning. And we come to the concluding part of today's session. And we were listening to Professor Meghna Guhathakurta, who was speaking on fleeing and staying, a nuanced view of the Bangladesh refugee crisis of 1971. This was part of the CRG online lecture series, which is also part of the Calcutta Research Group Migration and Forced Migration Studies, supported by Rosa Luxembourg Stiftung, Berlin, and Institute of Human Sciences, IWM, Vienna. I thank Professor Meghna Guhathakurta for an outstanding lecture today, and I believe that all the listeners, they have enjoyed this lecture thoroughly. And before we conclude this session, I would request my colleague Rajat to say the concluding words. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I convey my gratitude to the audience of this public lecture. On behalf of CRG, I am thankful to Professor Meghna Guhathakurta for her fascinating presentation. This lecture enlightened several aspects in the field of refugee studies and refugee problems during the conflict, as well as the importance of reading personal narratives for this purpose. We are also thankful to Professor Sabyasachi Chaudhury for moderating the discussion. My colleague Shatabdi Dash helped me by designing this poster. She deserves a separate mention for this thoughtful work. I am also thankful to the members of the webinar committee, my colleagues at the office, and the acting director of CRG for their advice and help. Last but not the least, I would like to convey thanks to our funders, Rosa Luxembourg Stiftung and Institute of Human Sciences, Vienna, for their continuing support towards our research in migration and post-migration studies. This lecture, we will edit this lecture and shortly upload it in our YouTube channel so that all of you can access this lecture and use it for academic purpose. Thank you.
Meghna, can we make a request? Can we get the paper for Refugee Watch?
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I can't write a paper right now, so maybe later on next year.
Can we transcribe what you said and send it to you?
Oh yes, that you can do. Yes.
Okay. We'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Bye-bye. Thank you all very much for giving me this opportunity. It was a very emotional moment for me, but it was also very, it was very interesting to say these things to a very interesting audience. Thank you all.
Thank you, Meghna.